Georgia wound up having one of the toughest schedules in the country last season. Uh, you looked at it preseason, and yeah, it looked like a tough schedule, but some of the teams that they played wound up being, maybe a little bit better than we thought. And yeah, it turned out to be a really, really tough schedule. So we all know that the conference schedule is going to be the same. You're just going to flip the home and away. So let's break it all down for you here in this video. And again, we're going to just start by looking at the schedule, and we will go to the non-conference games. So that's really going to be the biggest change this year. No Clemson on the schedule. Instead, they will have Marshall, Austin Peay, Charlotte, and then they will play Georgia Tech at the end of the season. So a much easier non-conference schedule. Marshall is not a bad team, although I guess they did lose their coach and a lot of players, so they're probably not going to be very good. And then Austin Peay, Charlotte, these should all be easy wins for Georgia. Looking at that Georgia Tech game on the road, that could be interesting to close out the season. Of course, last year's game was a lot closer than people expected. This is a Georgia Tech program that seems to be on the rise, getting better and better. So that could be a tricky game there at the end. But overall, again, this non-conference schedule, much, much easier for the Georgia Bulldogs in 2025. Let's look at the home and away now. Home games will be against Marshall, Austin Peay, Alabama, Kentucky, Ole Miss, Texas, and Charlotte. So the difference this year is a lot of these big games, some of their toughest opponents are all at home. Last year they had to play Alabama on the road, had to play Ole Miss on the road, had to play Texas on the road, lost 2 of those 3 games. This year they get those big games at home. You take that and then also add in that non-conference schedule being a lot easier. This is a much more manageable schedule for Georgia, but it's still tough. I mean, you look at the road games, you've got Tennessee. This is going to be a good Tennessee team. This is a team that I think a lot of people maybe will predict to go to the SEC championship. So that's a tough one. Auburn is a team that could be a lot better this year, and that is a tough place to play. You've got Florida, not a road game, not a true road game, but it is a neutral site game. It is away from home, of course, playing in Jacksonville. Then you got Mississippi State on the road and Georgia Tech on the road. So yeah, I'm looking at Tennessee, Auburn, Florida, tough games away from home. Georgia Tech even potentially a tough game away from home. But the good news is you get maybe the 3 tough, well, I wouldn't say the 3 toughest games, but 3 of the 4 toughest opponents, 3 of the 5 toughest opponents, you get them at home with Alabama, Ole Miss, and Texas. So that's the good news of the schedule. But again, it is a very tough conference schedule, very tough. They will start with Marshall there on August 30th. Then they get Austin Peay on September 6th. And then it's right into SEC play. It's on the road at Tennessee, September 13th. Going to be a huge game. And it seems like these teams usually play closer to the end of the season. So that's going to be a lot different seeing this game. That's kind of that spot where Georgia used to always play South Carolina. But this year they will play Tennessee. And, of course, they don't even play South Carolina. That's a matchup. There are a lot of matchups that I do miss from the old schedules. Like Auburn, LSU. That's a game we saw every year. Alabama, Mississippi State, Georgia, South Carolina. Anyways, back to the schedule. 2 easy games, then Tennessee on the road, and then a bye week before playing Alabama. That's probably a good spot for that bye week because that Alabama game is going to be a big one, and it's coming off of a very tough game against Tennessee. So a good spot for their first bye week. And again, remember, all the teams will have 2 bye weeks, just like last season, just because of the way that the Saturdays fall. So after Alabama, they've got Kentucky on October 4th. We all know how close that game was last year. You feel like it shouldn't be a challenge for Georgia, but it is right in between Alabama and a road game at Auburn. So who knows? Maybe it could be a scary game for them again. But Auburn on the road will be tough, but it's back home after that to face Ole Miss. That's a difficult stretch. When you look at Alabama and then that road game against Auburn and then Ole Miss, it's a difficult stretch, but those 4 games, at least they get 3 of them at home. And if you look at this schedule, they don't have any back-to-back true road games. They do have Florida and Mississippi State away from home, but Mississippi State, we're talking about probably the worst team in the SEC. So they get that bye week after Ole Miss. Then they do play Florida in Jacksonville November 1st. Going to be a huge game. They always get a bye week before that game, and they will get it again this year. Then it's Mississippi State on the road. Again, I don't think Mississippi State's going to be great next year, but let's say they do turn it around and they're much improved. That is a trap game. That has trap game written all over it. It's after a rivalry game against Florida, and it's right before Texas, which will be a huge, huge game. So, potentially a trap game against Mississippi State, but if they're not very good, I mean, it's not going to matter. Georgia should roll. They're just going to have so much more talent. But that's interesting. It's at least noteworthy. You've got Texas, again, on November 15th. Then they'll have an easier game against Charlotte, and they'll close things out with a rivalry game against Georgia Tech on November 29th. We see teams in the SEC a lot of times will have this easy game before their rivalry game. I don't think Georgia usually is one of those teams, but this year they are. And again, Charlotte, and then on the road at Georgia Tech. So I'm looking at, again, this schedule. The Alabama to Ole Miss games, those 4 games in a row, that's going to be a pretty tough stretch. Florida, Mississippi State, Texas, potentially a tough stretch. Depends on how good Mississippi State turns out to be. And again, that's the trap game that I would circle. It's hard to imagine Georgia losing that game right now, but who knows? Again, overall, this schedule in the SEC is going to be tough again. You look at, I was actually surprised by this. So if you look at the winning percentage of their opponents, this is their 2024 winning percentage. Again, the 2025 opponents they actually have a losing win percentage, 47%. And I think that's a little bit misleading in terms of the difficulty of the schedule because of the fact that they play Kentucky and Auburn and Mississippi State. So you've got 5 opponents that were not very good last year, or 3 opponents, I should say, that were not very good last year. But then you've got 5 really, really good teams. So those teams bring that win percentage down. And that's why, again, you do look at some easy wins potentially for Georgia, but you also look at some very difficult games in the SEC. So a much easier non-conference schedule, but again, it'll be a tough conference schedule in the SEC for Georgia in 2025.